we are going to focus on Badr Khan and Nurallah massacres. And this is the first part of a two-part lecture that is going to go into the various aspects so that you can have a good grasp of what happened and when did it happen and who were the characters and which were the powers kind of surrounding all of these events and what may have sparked one of the greatest tragedies to be suffered by the Assyrian people. I want to talk about three things before I delve into today's lecture, and that is that there are three sort of interrelated tragic observations that I can make about this lecture. The first is obviously the horrible human tragedy suffered by the Assyrians, the people living in the Hakkari mountains specifically, and that would be, of course, the people of Ochanos, the people of Diz, the people of Tiari, Lower Tiari and Upper Tiari, the people of Tchuma later, and so on. And the horrible economic loss, in addition to the human suffering, the tragedies suffered by the people, and then subsequently the economic losses inflicted on the Assyrians. The second kind of related tragic observation here is that the Assyrians during this time in the Hakkari mountains were largely, although not exclusively, they were largely disunited as a people. And this played into the events that we will look at that are going to transpire. And the third tragedy that is my observation is how, unfortunately, the Assyrians have not learned from this lesson in a significant way. And we will talk about that at the end of the lecture. But let's go in and find out today what happened, who were the personalities, who were the powers that were affecting changes and driving the winds of change in the Middle East during the time of Badr Khan and Nurallah massacres. So let's understand, first of all, the context. Let's understand the regional powers that were at play here. We are going to talk about the emirates and the emirs of the area that the Assyrians were living in. Emirate, by the way, is a princely entity. Emir is a word in Arabic for prince. We will talk about the Assyrians of Hakkari and their state, the various tribes. We will discuss the division of the Kurds at that time. We will discuss the role of the patriarch and the tribes vis-a-vis the tribes. We will also then talk about the divisions of the Assyrians, and we will get into the details of the tragedy. So during this time, we should understand the demography of the Assyrians as follows. First, look to the left of the screen, and you'll see the over 200 villages of the Nineveh plain where the Assyrians were residing, whether under terms like Chaldean or Suraya or Assyrian or Nestorian or Jacobite. These are Assyrian villages, people speaking the same language, practicing the same culture, and so on. Look to the center, and that is the area of Tur Abdin, Midyat, and Diyarbakir, and other towns, Mardin, and so on. These are various villages where about 100,000 of our people lived, mostly belonging to the Syriac Orthodox and later the Syriac Catholic Church. And then to the right is the area of the Hakkari, and next to it, the area of Urmia. And In between is the area that we refer to as Shmizden. I had various questions about this area. Targavar, Margavar is here, the villages of Mawana, the village of Marbishu, and so on. That's in between the Hakkari and Urmia area. Now, what held together the area of Urmia and the Hakkari, and in between the area of Shmizden, was the leadership of the Patriarch of the Church of the East, who, as we have seen, various authors referred to as, in the beginning, a patriarch of a church, and then later sort of a tribal prince, a person who has wields secular power through religious legitimacy and is sort of a mediator. This is the area that we're talking about so that we're clear on the map. Today, it is comprised of northern Iraq, northwestern Iran, southeastern Turkey, where unfortunately the earthquake is, and eastern Syria. So these are the areas that concern us, and these are the areas where Assyrians resided in. To their north are the Armenians, largely living the Armenians among them, and to the north and to their east are Kurds, to the south are Arabs in terms of ethnicity. Now, one very important part of our understanding of what's going to go wrong for the Assyrians is understanding the various divisions of regional powers and international powers in this area. Russia had been growing and had been seeking its presence in the Middle East for a number of centuries, really since the collapse of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks, to the Ottoman power in 1453, retaking Constantinople on behalf of the Orthodox Christians had always been lingering in the minds of the czars. Remember, we had the Holy Roman Empire in Europe after the destruction of the actual Roman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then later Russia wants to claim that title, as it were, because it is a descendant of Constantinople. So Russo-Ottoman conflicts over 7 wars between the two powers eventually lead to Russia having a very prominent place in the Middle East and putting pressure. This takes place, and Russia wants to be the protector, at least statedly so, wants to be the protector of the Orthodox Christians within the realm of the Ottomans. Remember, the Ottoman Empire has power over Constantinople, which is a revered Christian city. It has power over Antioch, which is a revered Christian city. It has power over Jerusalem, which was a revered Christian city, and finally Alexandria. All of these places had very important roles to play in the history of Christianity, and they are all at this time dominated by the Ottomans. And of course, Russia wants to play a role for, of course, ideological reasons, but also there are interests here. To further their strategic and ideological goals, the Russians nurtured a nationalist movement or nationalist movements of fellow Orthodox Christians in the Balkans through Pan-Slavism, which is the idea, just as the Turks had Turanism, which is an idea of an entity or a people larger than the state. So the Russians want to expand and inspire kind of a larger Russian understanding of ethnicity, which is Slavic ethnicity, and inspire these movements, but they are also checked by their own interests in terms of getting along with the Ottomans. The Russians' greater global focus during this period in turn caused Western European powers to react by aiding and propping up Ottomans. Now, During this time also, the Ottomans suffer fracturing their Egyptian governorate separates, and in a battle in 1839, Battle of Nizib in Syria, we have the defeat of the Ottoman army and the threatening of the very basis of the Sultanate in Istanbul, or what used to be Constantinople. And of course, why does Russia rush, as it were, to the rescue of the Ottomans, and so do the British? They do not want to see, they would rather see a weak empire rather than a powerful new empire in Egypt, being based in Egypt. They would rather see a sick man of Europe, as it were. This is a reference to the Ottoman Empire. And so they do not want to see the Ottoman Empire failing. They do like to see it weak, but not failing. So the Russian agenda in the Middle East during the 19th century was based on various interests, as we said. Russia is expanding its commercial and geopolitical reach to equal or surpass the imperial projects of other European nations and other powers during this time, namely France and Britain. And this goal continued also to be shaped by stated ideological interests. So there is often an understanding among Assyrians in particular that Russia sought to sort of help the Christians of the Middle East. You have to understand this within a larger context of Russia's interests. In other words, Russia was not merely swayed by religious interests to assist the Christians of the empire, it also had commercial interests. Now, what also sparks a lot of the events that trigger Russia to take an interest is the war waged by Napoleon in Egypt. His brief conquest of Egypt sparks major interest, what we call the Great Game between Britain and France, to gain power in the Mediterranean. And this is going to set the trend, not only of Western powers competing for their interests, but it is also going to begin to set the tone of Christian versus Muslim in a rather intense way. And we are going to see this play its role among the Assyrians of the Hakkari Mountains. Now, Western rivalries affected Russia and the Ottomans. Russia and the Ottoman Empire were affected by increasingly global rivalries of the major European powers. Here you see a cartoon showing various powers trying to take apart, each one with a scissors, to try to cut apart the Ottoman Empire. During the rise of European manufacturing and the Industrial Revolution, by the way, the United States also grew during this time after the Civil War in terms of its manufacturing power. The Ottomans were bound by the constraints of various capitulations and agreements, which enabled an influx of European goods to dominate Ottoman markets in ways that more and more favored European economies instead of their own, to the detriment of Ottoman revenue, to the detriment of the Ottoman economy. The 1838 Anglo-Turkish Commercial Convention removed any local monopolies in Turkey, allowing British trade and merchants to dominate the area. The economic dealings of Europe in the 19th century had damaging effects on Ottoman fiscal sovereignty, culminating in the capitulations. So the Ottomans capitulated to the Western powers, and this is going to get the Ottomans to look internally at the Assyrians. How exactly? I would like you to think about this. Now, both Russia and the Ottoman Empire reacted to the dramatic events that followed the French Revolution during the first 3 decades of the 19th century. Russians, ruled by Tsar Nicholas, who you see pictured or painted, not pictured, painted on the right. were also able to capitalize on Ottoman insecurities and thus soften their previously confrontational stance toward the Ottomans. So rather than engaging in a conflict with the Ottomans, the Russians thought maybe they could obtain concessions. By the 1820s, the Ottoman Empire appeared to Russia as a preferable to many of its alternatives, despite ostensible Russian support for the anti-Ottoman liberation movements led by their Orthodox brethren, such as the Greek War of Independence, among others, and the Bulgarians and so on. Remember, we are now experiencing, after the French Revolution, also the age of nationalism. The winds of nationalism have not affected the Assyrians of the Hakkari Mountains in the way that they have affected Eastern Europe at this time. Keep that in mind. So Russia helps the Ottomans by checking Muhammad Ali, who's the governor of Egypt and who is a former Ottoman official, but he wants to defeat the Ottoman Empire in the 1830s and displace them altogether. This prompts the Russians to assist the Ottomans and to find a way to be able to deal with them. Now, in reaction to this, the British and the French are able to soon have treaties replaced. In 1841, London Straits Convention, which satisfied the Russians but brought other great powers into a diplomatic process more closely. So now we have the Russians taking an interest in a weak Ottoman Empire, exploiting it financially. We have the British and the French doing the same. Russia also has an interest in Azerbaijan. Of course, you're familiar with Baku. Those of you who are familiar with the current conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan should understand that Azerbaijan is the northern Azerbaijan, which was given up to the Russians by the Qajars. Before this is a major oil production area, and Baku has become, was one of the first areas drilled in 1848, and the first refinery constructed there in 1859. And Baku rapidly grew from a small outpost into a wealthy and sophisticated city that it is today. European investors entered the market by the end of the 19th century. Azerbaijan was producing more than half of the world's oil supply. This is incredible. And the Russians had a hand in this. Until, of course, we have the revolution, the Soviet revolution. We're not going to get into that at this time. We mentioned the Greek War of Independence and the spark of nationalism throughout Europe, which is going to sweep into the east and is going to affect the Assyrians and the Armenians, as well as the Kurds at a later time. Now, specifically in the area where the Assyrians were living and which concerns us today, the Hakkari, from the 16th century onwards, the emirates of Botan and Hakkari had been awarded as autonomous entities. Autonomous entities meaning they are not answering to the Sultan as, for example, areas in the interior of Anatolia, which may be closer to, say, the center, which is Constantinople or Istanbul. After the victory over the Safavids in the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514, the Ottoman Sultan Salim arranged for the rulers of Botan and for the leading dynasties of neighboring Hakkari, Bahdinan, Bitlis, and other places, Hasankeyf, to govern along these lines. This is when the Assyrian tribes also become recognized entities which enter into the record, as it were. We begin to hear about the tribes of Tiari. Of course, we hear about them earlier, Tiari, Jilu, Tkhuma, and so on. These names become more familiar to us during this time. Later, after the 14th, 15th, 16th century, the Ottomans begin to centralize and begin to impose reforms, partly because of pressure from European powers, partly because they also want to get their act together and become like other Western powers, because the way that Western powers act is the way that the Ottomans would like to act towards their peoples. So Ottoman Safavid wars allowed the Emirates to take advantage of the rivalries between these two powers. So the Assyrians are living in this area, and the various Kurdish emirs who have their own sort of autonomous power are able to take advantage of the Ottoman rivalry with the Safavids and later with the Russians. This is going to also play a role in the First World War. The origins of the Emirates, as we said, date back from the 1300s all the way up to the 1800s, when the last of them disappeared. Ottoman control was accomplished later in Kurdish Emirates than in other parts of the Ottoman Empire, as we said. And part of the reason for this is the geography. We have very difficult terrain in the Hakkari Mountains. For example, in Mosul, it is not the case. The drive for centralization in the Ottoman Empire affected the Kurdish emirs. Between Kurdish emirs disfavored them, while Assyrians viewed them as an opportunity. According to one PhD dissertation by a Turkish student, the drive to reform the Ottoman Empire was viewed differently by the Kurdish emirs, who viewed it as a reduction of their power, whereas the Assyrians looked at it as an opportunity to change their environment into one where equality is more of the followed principle. So the efforts to centralize began in the reign of Mahmud II, 1808 to 1839, and the reforms, labeled as tanzimat or tanzimat in Arabic, guaranteed to Ottoman subjects equality and security of life and property without distinction of race and religion. Of course, this is the ideal. In truth, this was not really followed, but this was the stated ideal. The goal was to propel the empire into a position of modernization, as we said, to compete with the rest of Europe. The damage of the old model of Ottoman government, coupled with the loss of territory and insufficiently industrializing and a declining economy, left the empire at a disadvantage from an international standpoint, as well as an internal standpoint. Domestic issues intensified with ethnic and religious discrimination on the part of Muslims against non-Muslim populations, which led the Sultan to propose liberal reforms to end the old traditions of racial segmentation. However, the interests of the Sultan may not have coincided with those of lesser officials or with the Kurdish emirs. Remember, the Ottoman Empire is a very large empire, and what is necessarily in the interest of the Sultan in Istanbul or Constantinople is not necessarily in the interest of various pashas who rule, for example, in Julamark or in Mosul or in other places, Diyarbakir. The places that interest us for today's lecture are the area in between the borders of Iran and Turkey, and specifically Bashkala, which is in the northern area of the Hakkari, Julamark, which is today called Hakkari, a city, and Jazira. All three of these prominent places, prominent locations, are located within Turkey today. And you could see in this map, of course, Ashitha. There are also the various Assyrian tribal areas such as Jilu and Tkhuma and Diari and Baz and Diz. Now, one central important character is Badr Khan Bek. His name is spelled in various ways, of Botan. Botan is an emirate around the area of Jazira and Diyarbakir. And this this personality, who we do not have any photographs of, we have a painting of what his dress may have looked like, which is to the right here. It's a drawing that's not well described, but it is seems like a watercolor that is unfinished. Bedr Khan was born in 1803. He was the last of the Kurdish Mir or Kurdish Mir of the Emirate of Botan. He's the hereditary head of the house of Rojaki, whose seat was the ancient Bitlis castle, descended from the Sharaf Khan Bidlisi. Bedr Khan was born in Jazira, now in Turkey. He became the Mir of the Emirates of Botan in 1821 and ruled until 1847. The Bedr Khans also claimed descent from Khalid ibn Walid, a general called the Sword of Allah by the Prophet of Islam. Now, Bedr Khan proved to be a very able ruler, and like many Kurdish sheikhs or mullahs or aghas or emirs, he claimed descent from the Arabs. Many of the Kurds had this tradition that they were originally Arabs to link them better to the Prophet of Islam. So he comes to power in 1821 when he's 18 years old, fairly young. After coming to power, he immediately sets out to strengthen his power over the Botan Emirate, which has been divided into sister emirates and has been a scene of quarrel by various rival tribes. And of course, this is a challenge for any of the Kurdish emirates to bring together the tribes as much as possible. He grew increasingly independent from Ottoman rule and ignored many duties of emir to the sultan. Remember this autonomy that was given to him, he went and extended, kind of pushed the envelope vis-a-vis the sultan. Eventually refusing to send requisite armed forces when the sultan called up during Ottoman-Russian War of 1828. He even went further by minting his own coins, which was unacceptable, and having the Friday prayers recite his name, both of which are representative of a Muslim ruler's independence. He modernized his army through centralization, creating elite units from all the tribes and putting them under his direct command instead of dealing through tribal chiefs. He created regiments from some of the best men of all the tribes, which were more loyal to him than to their own aghas. Such men of these regiments were called ghulam, or a word that is even used in Assyrian today, or adopted, which literally means slave or servant, ghulama. This new system, although good for the mirs, meant that the aghas lost their independence since they had sacrificed their best men. As with the mir of Kur, of Rwandos and Baban, Ahmed Pasha, Bedr Khan produced his own arms and ammunition in Jazira, and he financed it through the income he collected from his subjects. So there are various references to how efficient, how ruthless, how cruel Bedr Khan was, and depending on to whom you speak, you might get one perspective or another. For many of the Assyrians, he was a very harsh ruler. For other leaders whom he wanted to co-opt, he may have been better. It may have been better to deal with him, for example, and he certainly was able to work with some Assyrians. Regrettably, at the time of the conflict, that didn't make any difference. Specifically with regard to where most of the Assyrian tribes lived, Bedr Khan was not the ruler. It was Nurallah. Now, who was Nurallah? Nurallah was the brother of the previous ruler of the Hakkari, and he was not really the next person in line who was supposed to rule. He was the brother, and he was the rival to his nephew, Suleiman Bey. Now, it just so happened that as far as the leader of the Assyrians was concerned, Suleiman Bey was his friend, not so much Nurallah. There was a conflict, and Marshumun, the head of the Assyrian tribes, the head of the Church of the East, was friendlier, had better relations with Suleiman Bey than with Nurallah. And according to one scholar, both the fear of his rival, Suleiman Bey, and Marshamun's desire to become more independent left no choice for Nurallah Beg but to ask for assistance from Badr Khan, who took this as a great opportunity to become a patron of the ancient emirate of Hakkari. Badr Khan took advantage to also take the riches of the Assyrian Christians as a, quote, Muslim punishing infidels and give those riches to strengthen his troops. Of course, any opportunity that a leader had to grow his supplies, his assets, as it were, is going to be taken. And Badr Khan was very perceptive to see a conflict arising in another emirate. It wasn't because he's a Kurdish nationalist or a Muslim fundamentalist that he wants to help a fellow Kurd dominate his area as to the conflict between Nurallah and the Assyrians and Marshamun specifically. It's really because he wants to gain advantage. So we understand that there are rivalries between the uncle and the nephew here, Nurallah and Suleiman Bey. Predecessor of the emir, Nurallah was the father of the nephew, the brother to whom the government belonged. Superior abilities prevailed over hereditary right, meaning Nurallah got to rule because of his abilities. A lawful heir was assigned to an inferior post, his rival keeping a strict lookout for anything like an effort to recover his own. So Nurallah always looked at Suleiman Bey with jealousy, watched over him to make sure he does not try to take or regain what was lost to him, which was the seat of the Emir of Hakkari. Nurallah had not dared to kill him, his nephew, because it would trigger a blood feud, which required descendants of the murdered to retaliate on the relations of the murderer till the equilibrium was restored to the satisfaction of all concerned. Assyrians refer to this as shqaltatula, or seeking revenge. And this was a very common method of recovering justice that was taken in the Hakkari Mountains. As far as the Assyrians were concerned, during this time, various officials looked at the Assyrians, and I've had these quotes up for you before in lectures, looked at the Assyrians as maintaining their independence against the Muslims, to whom they have rendered themselves very formidable. This is according to C. James Rich. And he goes on to say that Assyrians are known for strength and bravery and so on, vis-a-vis the Kurds. And this is a very interesting observation coming just before the tragedies that we are going to talk about. Another very good observer tells Reverend Eli Smith and Reverend Dwight, coming from the United States in the 1830s, that, and this is Captain Sir John Campbell, who has a keen eye for detail. He assures the Americans that the Assyrians are by far the most powerful people of the Hakkari, that they are much feared by the Kurds and will perhaps before many years be left by them in undivided possession of the country, meaning the Hakkari. He entertained a high opinion of their character. And there are many such reports talking about the invincibility of the Assyrian tribes, specifically the Tiari, the Tkhuma, and the others, and how powerful they were and how unintimidated they were, unlike other Christians in the Middle East. Now, with this perceived power on the part of the Assyrians, with this growing interest that we will refer to by the West in the Assyrians, we have the sentiments of Kurds who are looking at the Assyrians and looking at the missionaries and telling the missionaries who come and go and who form relations with the Assyrians, you are the forerunners of those who come to take this country. Therefore, it is best that we should take the first what you have, as you will afterwards take our property. So this, according to William Ainsworth, a British missionary, was the attitude of many of the Kurds towards English and American missionaries, that they were about to take what is ours. And certainly this was given everything that we talked about in terms of the power of Russia, the power of the British, the concessions that the British have sought from the Ottomans, the concessions that the Russians have sought from the Ottomans, and so on and so forth, combined with these missionary visits to the Assyrians, leads a lot of the Muslims surrounding the Assyrians, including and in particular the Kurds, to be very careful of the Assyrians. As Western intervention was intensifying and Ottoman authorities were reforming and centralizing. In other words, the Kurds are losing their power with the centralization from the Ottomans. The Kurds seem to be afraid of losing their superiority to non-Muslims such as the Assyrians and the Armenians. Kurdish ulama, religious leaders, were speaking out against the idea of being equal with Assyrians, Armenians, and the Jews. In other words, we are losing our status. So it's not so much the religious concern here. It's that we are losing our economic, our social, our political status to people who, well, should be, according to our ideology, our inferiors. In 1841, Nurallah burns the house of Marshaman, and you see a picture here. It is attacked, it is burned, and Marshaman is forced to escape. And nothing happens at this time other than this attack. In other words, there is no large-scale attack against the Assyrians. This is a signal, and it is likely that this act, because of the growing rivalry between Marshaman and Nurallah, this act is either agreed to or encouraged by the Ottomans. Again, keep the big picture in mind here of Russian pressure and British pressure from the outside, and the developments from within with the missionaries, the Assyrians engaging in various negotiations with missionaries. Remember, the Ottomans are not privy to exactly what is going on. What is the interest of the missionaries? Is it strictly religious? Is it political? Is it military? Is it economic? And we have missionaries such as Justin Perkins who write to Mar Oraham Shummun, the trials and sufferings you and your people have long endured in these lands of Mohammedan oppression or Islamic oppression. We are aware of the sufferings that you have endured. Now, this also leads Marshaman and other Assyrians to feel that perhaps there is some hope. It isn't simply references to the Bible, it is some perhaps some genuine reassurance that something more is on the way. And this is the uncertainty, excuse me, of the situation that even the Ottomans are observing. An American missionary by the name of Asahel Grant enters the country. He's one of the earlier missionaries that come in. And in 1842, he builds atop a mound in Ashitha, what he claims is a school, and what the Kurds and the Ottomans may think is something more than that. For example, they may think it is a fortress. What is a fortress for other than military activity? And with everything going on, danger is looming. Now, we will get into Asahel Grant's role in the later class, but I want to tell you that the Americans in Iraq today praise him, including John Agrusto, praise him for being one of the sort of pioneers of American entry into Iraq, as it were, or the area of Iraq, and view him as kind of an explorer of sorts who, although of course he was a missionary, stated as a missionary, but he was also a representative of the United States. Now, Ainsworth is concerned and tells us that these ties, so-called ties to the West, this sudden interest so explicitly and so actively shown on the part of other Christian nations toward the tribe of people, the Assyrians, has called them forth into new importance in the eyes of the Muslims and will undoubtedly be the first step to their overthrow, unless they are assisted in such an emergency by sound advice or the friendly interference of the representatives of brotherly Christian nations at Constantinople. It will be the most cruel thing imaginable to have excited so much attention from surrounding powers towards the condition of these able, courageous, and pious mountaineers, only to leave them to the tender mercies of Islam. This is a forewarning of things to come. And of course, this is an observer from the outside who has no doubt been aware of the various movements of various regional and international powers around and inside of the Ottoman Empire. And he's very concerned about the Assyrians, specifically the ones in the Hakkari. Well, how do the Ottomans feel? According to one scholar, a Turkish scholar, the Porte had long hoped for a clash between the two unruly subjects, the Kurds and the Assyrians. A conflict between these two sides would weaken both, eliminate the Assyrians, and provide a pretext while preparing the ground for the Ottomans to remove the Kurdish notables from Kurdistan. Going through many documents on this issue in the Ottoman archives, one can easily see that from the very beginning, the Porte was aware of Bedr Khan Beg's intention to massacre this Christian community. So the Ottomans knew that Bedr Khan is going to try to attack the Assyrians along with Nurallah, and they were hoping that not only would this be the demise of the Assyrians and possibly the links of Western powers to the Assyrians, but it would also bring an end to the Kurdish emirates of Bedr Khan and Nurallah and others. Of course, Bedr Khan and Nurallah were in the dark about this. Now, keep in mind that Mar Shumun, Mar Oraham Shumun, as well as Nurallah and Bedr Khan, as well as Suleiman Bey, were all Ottoman officials. In other words, this conflict is between all of the Ottoman officials. Certainly the most favored of them was among his own people, was possibly Mar Shumun, Mar Oraham Shumun, who ruled as patriarch from 1820 to 1861, one of the longest reigns of the Church of the East for a patriarch. Now, what's the status of Mar Shumun? Well, he is struggling with outside oppression as well as internal division among his own people. The hostility between the Hakkari's Assyrians and the Kurdish emirs has been aggravated recently, according to Reverend Laurie, by the present patriarch grasping after a degree of power said to have been unknown to his predecessors. And we will get into this in detail in the next lecture, but I just want to say something about why Reverend Laurie is saying this. Of course, Mar Shumun was aware of what is happening in the world. It's not necessarily that he was grasping for more power, but he was seeing the movement of Ottoman officials vis-a-vis the Kurds as a transforming phenomenon. He was seeing the centralization. He was aware of it, and he wanted his equal place for himself and his people, of course, among them. And this may have been seen by people below him, such as the various tribes, as grasping, in the words of Laurie, for more power. As he possessed no little diplomatic tact and energy, the jealousy of the Kurds was full as great as it had ever been. Mar Shumun was beloved by his people, and the Kurdish emirs were extremely jealous of him. And I want to give you, before we close, I want to give you a picture of how the Assyrians received their patriarch in the mountains, this tribal prince, this head of their church, a person they called Rishit Awahate, head of the fathers. This is the description given by Reverend Badger, George Percy Badger, of the patriarch entering the village of Ashitha. Quote, the patriarch had made his appearance on top of the mountains. A general turnout now took place. Men, women, and children, to the number of 1,000, congregated around the church, while the more hardy and zealous went forward to be the first to greet their chief. So they view him as their leader. I joined myself to this party. This is the English missionary. And in exchange for my salutation of kissing the patriarch's hand, received his blessing and a hearty welcome. You could tell that this tradition is an ancient one of kissing the patriarch's hand that is observed up until today. The group was now one of indescribable interest, and the scene around grand in the extreme. Mountains upon mountains hemmed in the secluded valley on every side. The village poured forth its tenants from the scattered dwellings who flocked from every quarter, some leading a son or daughter through the deep snow, while mothers were seen bearing in their arms their infant offspring, whom they presented to the patriarch that he might lay his hands upon them and bless them. So you see here, not only is he revered as a tribal, as a princely personality, but also as a healer, as the head of a religious order that is respected by his people. Marshaman and his followers went up directly to the door and kissed the cross engraving the wall above the church, then sat down on the step leading into the church. The assembled crowd standing at a respectful distance, he seemed to know everyone present. And as each came forward in a stooping posture of respect, and with an uncovered head to kiss his hand, he greeted him with some familiar inquiry about his own weal and that of his family. I cannot better describe the person of Marshaman than by quoting the language of Dr. Grant. So what Badger here is describing is the familiarity of the leader with his people, the closeness that he has with his people at this very difficult time, as the clouds of the conflict is gathering here between the Assyrians and the Kurds. And Grant describes them this way. The patriarch is 38 years of age. He was 4 years older when I first saw him. Above a middle stature, well proportioned with an expressive and rather intelligent countenance, while his large flowing robes, his Kurdish turban, and his long gray beard give him a patriarchal and venerable aspect, which is heightened by a uniformly dignified demeanor. Were it not for the youthful fire in his eye and his vigor and activity, I should have thought him nearer 50 than 38. In other words, he looks much older. But his friends assured me that the hoariness of his beard and locks was that of care and not of age. His situation is certainly a difficult and responsible one, since he is, in an important sense, the temporal as well as the spiritual head of his people. To preserve harmony and settle differences between the various tribes of his spirited mountaineers and with the Kurds by whom they are surrounded is a labor that would tax the wisdom of the greatest statesman. And I could hardly wonder that the grayness of care was prematurely sitting upon his locks. It was quite evident that the patriarch's anxiety extended not less to the temporal than to the spiritual wants of his flock, as his first inquiries related particularly to their political prospects, the movements of Turkey, and the designs of European powers was with regard to these countries, and why they did not come and break the arm of Muslim power by which many of his people had so long been oppressed, and for fear of which the main body of them were shut up in their mountain fastness. So you see here, Marshaman's concerns are about his people, and this is being described by a missionary. And I believe that this is a very good description of his main concerns. They are not simply religious, they are also political and, by extension, military. Now, Badger ends that this description applies in every respect to Marshaman when I first saw him. In his person, he had altered little, if at all. But there was a heavier gloom upon his brow, and the dark foreboding of the gathering storm, which was so soon to burst upon himself and his people, frequently found utterance and mingled with his familiar talk. The portrait in the front piece, now Badger is referring to the book, and he's referring to the portrait that you see here on the right, was taken 7 years later when the unfortunate patriarch was a mere wreck of his former self. So the drawing that you see here, the portrait, is of the patriarch, which, according to George Percy Badger, was a wreck of his former self, a wreck of the patriarch's former self, having endured the various conflicts and difficulties and tragedies of his people. Now, what happens next is that while he and his party are in Ashitha, they are going to discuss with the people of Ashitha and with the people of Tiari and other towns and other villages of the Assyrians the gloom that is lurking, the doom that is about to be experienced by the Assyrians, and they are going to warn of the situation and do the best they can to try to cure it. Unfortunately, we don't know if they're going to succeed in the least.